Thank you, Raquel. Thank you, everyone, for being here this morning. It's always such a pleasure to be here. We're going to be doing a quick review of pages 51 through 57. Today is 57. So we're over this week, we finished chapter 4. We finished Perek Daled, and we begin Perek Hey, the 5th chapter. And sometimes it's very clear when we move from one chapter to the next that it's sort of clear why one chapter has finished and another has begun, sort of moving to a different topic. Here, it doesn't quite feel that way, at least to me. We're sort of continuing some conversations in a very similar vein at the beginning of Perek Hey as we are towards the end of Perek Daled. So there is a sense of over the course of this week, even though we're moving from one chapter to the next, we are still kind of in the same flow of conversation. And what we've moved from, in terms of from last week to this week, we've moved from a conversation about a man's obligations to his wife to discussions about other types of support that are incumbent upon people, particularly fathers, but also society, to provide for others. What are some of the obligations that a father has to his daughters, that a father has to his sons, that society has to orphans to sustain them? And also at the very end of last week, we touch on some kind of interesting comments on how to best begin to engage your child in the educational process and in Torah study. And so on 51, page 51, Nun Aleph, we finish up the discussion on the Mishnah that had opened up that conversation. And we finish up with that Mishnah and we start something new where we go back to the conversation about the obligations of the Ketubah. And here we find something very interesting, and we're going to look at it a little bit more inside and in depth in just a moment. But we start to imagine, or the rabbis start to imagine, what would happen if certain types of obligations or certain types of support or protection were not actually spelled out in the Ketubah. But they are rabbinically at least required. So we're going to see in just a moment what some of those things are. So we're kind of getting into here in this first Mishnah of our week and the examples that come out of it, and the following Mishnah as well, really thinking about what's the role that the rabbis play, not in one specific marriage necessarily, but in the bigger picture of how we as a society, or as the rabbis thought as a society, think about marriage and the obligations, particularly of a husband to a wife. And again, that's the context that we are working in, that we're learning in. That's the worldview of the rabbis. That's the definition, the rabbinic definition of marriage. So that's the language that I'm using. And we're going to see, and I'll share my screen in just a moment, and also put a link in the chat to a Google Doc where I've kind of pulled out some of the places over the course of this week where we see we are discussing pages 51 to 57. Those are the pages for this week. So we're going to see how the rabbis understand their authority and their role in intervening or legislating obligation, even when it's not clearly articulated or explicitly articulated in a ketubah. So we then move, I'm just going to kind of quickly move us through the flow of the week, and then we'll go and look at some text inside. We then start to move into more conversation about what happens if a woman decides that she's going to forfeit, not her ketubah, but she's going to forfeit the support that would be entitled to her after her husband's death. We see some interesting different customs based on geography, based on where people live. And then we conclude the fourth perek on page 54 with two stories of a man who is giving gifts on his deathbed. He's giving a dowry and he's giving money, for one story where he's giving a dowry for his daughter, and one story where we see that he is giving allocating money for his widow. So I think that's a nice, sometimes we see, I don't know how often it is, but if you've been kind of going through Daf Yomi for a while, you may have noticed that sometimes we end a chapter with some narrative, with some agadah that connects to the halacha, that connects to the legal discussions that we've been having, sort of like the story to illustrate the legal point that's been made. And so here we have a nice example of that. We've been talking about different ways that a man is meant to support his wife, his children, and here we have some stories that illustrate at least one example or one type of example of how that was done. And then we begin chapter 5, which is called Afal Pi, even though, that's the name of the chapter, because that's the first words of the Mishnah of the chapter. That's how it's done. And we're going to look at and see a conversation about what does it mean to increase the amount of support, to increase the amount of the ketubah. And again, we're going to come into see some examples, or at least one example of how the rabbis, again, step in to establish a particular, I don't know if I would call it a decree, but they create they create law in a situation where the law is not going to be so clear. So what do I mean by that? So let's take a look. Okay, let me share my screen here, and also I'm going to put the link into the chat. Everyone should be able to open this document, and I'm sharing my screen as well. So we're not going to read through all of this text, but what I want to focus on here is that I've highlighted the places where we have a Mishnah on 51b, and then again, another Mishnah on 52b, where we see some examples that are described as a stipulation of the court, Tanai Beit Din, a condition that is established by the Beit Din, by the court. These are examples where the wife or the woman could end up in a more precarious situation. So, for example, the first one here is that if he wrote in her marriage contract that she is entitled to a field worth 100 dinars instead of the 200 dinars to which she is actually entitled, and he did not additionally write for her, all the property I have shall serve as a guarantee for the payment of your marriage contract, he is nevertheless obligated to pay the full 200 dinars. He can't say that she can only take a mortgaged field for payment of her marriage contract, as it is a stipulation of the court. It is a Tanai Beit Din that all his property, not just a field, all his property is held as surety for the entire sum. So this is a situation where, for whatever reason, in the ketubah, the husband did not write the correct amount, whether that was intentional on his part or it was an error on his part. But the court steps in here, the rabbis step in here, and they say, if such a circumstance were to occur, she's still entitled to what she's entitled to. we are not going to allow the error or perhaps the malfeasance or the attempt to deceive on the part of the husband. We're not going to allow that to actually override what we've said the law is. So it's, in other words, even if something is stipulated in a contract, this is a case where we're not going to honor the words of the contract. But the rabbis come in and they say, no, we're making a t'nai that the woman is entitled to what we know she's entitled to, even if the contract says something different. Another example, if he didn't write for her, if you are taken captive, I will redeem you and restore you to me as a wife, he's obligated to do so, which is also a Tanai Beit Din. We know that this is one of the things that a husband is obligated to do for his wife if she is taken captive. And if he doesn't specify that in the marriage contract, he still has to do it. You can't get out of your obligations by omitting something from the written contract or by writing something different from what you are supposed to be giving to your wife in the contract. And we're going to see a couple more examples of that here on 52. More, again, ways in which the court steps in, the rabbis step in to offer protection in a situation where it might very well be the case, if you were looking just at the documents in front of you in a given situation, that that someone would lose out on some degree of support or protection that they are actually entitled to. So we see that several times. I forgot to highlight this one here, but we have 3 times in this Mishnah examples of a Tanai Beit Din. What I want to look at is just sort of an interesting, where else do we see this term in the Gemara? It's kind of interesting to sometimes look and see when we have a phrase or an expression that stands out in the way that it stands out to me, at least by being repeated so often in these Mishnayot. Where else do we see it? And we see it in Masechet Bava Kama, which, I don't know, it'll be some number of years from now. We will be getting into that. So you can join us on that Thursday morning when we look at Masechet Bava Kama. This is, now we're in kind of the world and the laws of money. I mean, that we're seeing that in our Masechet as well, how much the laws, monetary laws and laws of contracts and laws having to do with financial obligations are actually part of the conversation about marriage. But we have many other masechtot that deal with that, with those subjects explicitly. And we have a conversation or a fairly lengthy discussion that opens up with a Braita that states that Joshua stipulated 10 conditions, Tana'in, that's the same word that we've seen in our Mishnah, stipulated 10 conditions when he apportioned Eretz Yisrael among the tribes. So this is a moment where Joshua is actually, they've entered the land, and Joshua is actually laying out physically, here is the land that you're entitled to. Here's the land that this tribe is entitled to. And he's allocating and apportioning the actual land. So we're talking about distribution of property. And we're not going to look at it now, obviously, but there's a whole discussion of what are these 10 conditions and what did they mean? What does it mean? And aren't there really 11 and aren't there really 12? Actually, we think that there are more. But the point that I want to make here is that we again see the repetition of this phrase of Tanai Beit Din, Tanai Beit Din, Tanai Beit Din. And here's an example. I'll just read the first one. that the owner, it is an automatic right, even when not, I'm right over here, even when not explicitly granted, that this owner of a bee colony may enter the field of another and chop off the other's branch in order to save his bee colony. And afterwards, he gives him the value of the other's severed branch. So one can protect one's own property by causing damage to another's property, and then has to compensate that person accordingly. And that's a Tanai Beit Din. It's a place where the court steps in and thinking proactively, thinking ahead about what's a situation that might occur. Again, this was, I guess, clearly the kind of situation that would happen. And the other examples brought here in Bava Kama as well, where one might think, no, you can't go and damage and destroy someone else's property to save your own. But the court comes in and institutes this tanai, institutes this condition or this stipulation in order to protect a person who's trying to protect their own property. What I think is really fascinating is that this language is coming out of, at least in Bava Kama, and it's we're looking at Mishnayot and Braitot here, so it's hard to say which one came first, but at least we see that in the literature, in the early Tanaitic literature, we have some association between the court stepping in to create Tanaim, to create conditions or stipulations, and that is associated with the very act that Yehoshua did when he was leading the people, Bnei Israel, and helping them settle into the land of Israel. And I want to read this, and a question that has come up a lot as in the class that I teach, as we've been studying Daf Yomi over the past couple of years, is where do the rabbis think their authority comes from? And this is really a fundamental question of the study of rabbinic literature. Is how did rabbinic Judaism become the authoritative Judaism? And sometimes we see very explicit places where the rabbis will say, this is a halacha Moshe Sinai. This actually, it's not in the Torah, but it actually was given to Moshe at Sinai. There are other ways in which the rabbis kind of affirm or assert their authority as legal decisors of the halacha, of the religious law, which includes all of the societal law as well. But here it seems to me to be a little bit more subtle, because here the rabbis are kind of saying, we're going to connect our intervention, our ability to create a tanai, to create a condition, with the actions of someone from the Torah. Now, it's not Moshe, or from Tanakh, I should say. This is not Moshe, okay? This is not that level of authority, but Yehoshua was an authoritative leader of the Jewish people. And so here they're kind of intimating that our authority derives from, or is somehow connected to, the authority that our biblical leaders had. And it's a very subtle way of saying we're connected. When we come in and we make a stipulation, when we make a tanai that overrides a contract, or that overrides what your logical thinking might dictate, we actually have the authority to do that. We're doing the same thing that our biblical leaders did. So I just thought this was a great example. We don't see the reference to Yehoshua in our Masechet, but it's interesting to see that the other place where we see this language a lot in Bava Kama comes out of this Braita that is cited regarding Yehoshua. The last thing I want to just take a look at, and then I think there are some questions in the chat, and see if there are other questions. is we have here a phrase that has become very commonly known, very popular in contemporary Jewish life, and that is the phrase Tikkun Olam, which I think if you were to ask most American Jews, at least, what does Tikkun Olam mean? You would hear, if I ask you all to write in the chat, what is Tikkun Olam? I think a lot of the responses would be something along the lines of the Jewish value of repairing the world, which is repair the world, the actual translation of those words, Tikkun Olam. But the origins, the very first places where we see this phrase, which are we see it very early on in the Mishnayot in Masechet Gittin, which we'll get to in a little while, and we see it here in a Braita that is cited in the Gemara on one of our dapim this week, where it's again a rabbinic intervention. It has nothing to do with social justice. It has, or at least social justice, I think, the way most contemporary Jews might think about social justice. It is a rabbinic intervention, not so different from a Tanai, from these stipulations in that language that we saw earlier in these Mishnayot this week. But it's a rabbinic intervention to make something right in the world, or to allow for the stability of society. So what's the example here? We're talking about, as I said, one of the points of discussion in our study this week was what happens if a woman is taken captive and her husband has to redeem her. So if she was taken captive and they were seeking ransom from her husband of up to 10 times her value, far more than the usual ransom for a captive of this kind. Let me just say, as an aside, the question of how is one's value determined, I think is challenging. We've seen elsewhere that sometimes the value of a human life is based on how much they might be sold for as a slave. If they were sold as a slave, that's obviously a very, very challenging frame of reference for us, and there's a lot to say about that. And I think just the whole conversation about how do we value someone's life, which, by the way, is a contemporary policy question as well. But we're just, let's take at face value here that there's a way to value a woman's life, and she's being the ransom that's being asked for is 10 times that value. So on the first occasion that she is taken captive, he must redeem her. From this point forward, if she was taken captive a second time, if he wants to, he redeems her. But if he does not want to redeem her, he does not have to redeem her, as the sages obligated him to redeem her only once. And Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel says one does not redeem captives at more than their value, mipnei tikkun olam, for the betterment of the world, or the betterment of society. Because this seems to be, in some sense, the opposite, you might say, of the Tanaim that we saw earlier, where the rabbis are intervening in order to protect. Here, they're sort of intervening to say, look, there's a bigger problem that's going to ensue if we require every time someone is captured, if we require the whatever sum is being asked for to be paid as ransom. This is the, I think Sarah Ronas wrote about this in when she wrote about this daf this week in the My Jewish Learning Daily Daf, that this is why governments say we don't negotiate with terrorists, right? Because you kind of set the precedent that you can negotiate and get what you want. And so Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel says, look here, we actually have a situation where we can't, and he actually seems to be saying ever redeem captives. He's being more strict than the sages, because even though in this one situation, it's going to be devastating potentially for this woman and for her husband. But as social policy, this is really bad policy. So we have another example of that in Ketubot, the next couple of pages later on 56b. And so I think I want to bring these two things together, even though the phrases are different, Tanai Beit Din and Mipnei Tikkun Olam, because there are two examples of the ways in which the rabbis express their authority or exert their authority and come in to either override what seems to be the logical thing to do, or to, in this example that we just saw, to even be a little bit more harsh and say sometimes we need to take the whole context of our society and how our society works into consideration, even if that's going to be a challenging result for an individual. So these are great examples. I think of, again, the question of where does rabbinic authority come from and how do the rabbis exert their authority? And we see a couple of examples of that in our dapim this week. So I see there are a couple of comments or questions in the chat. We just have a couple of minutes. Legislation from the bench. Great. So I guess if anyone has a question that you want to put in the chat, or Rachel, do we allow people to unmute or raise your hand? I think we probably have time for one or maybe two questions.
Oops, I muted myself. If you want to, if you have a question you want to ask, you can throw it in the chat or raise your hand. I'll look for it. But we are coming up on time. Rabbi Passow, thank you so much. You always do such a good job, I think, of not only talking about the content of the Talmud, but helping us to see some of the structure that's there and helping us to understand how this thing is put together. It's complicated, and there are many hands, and it's not necessarily intuitive structure. Okay, Leah, I see you. I'll get to you in a second. And I think also these meta questions, like the authority of the rabbis, are really interesting. When I was in grad school, I started grad school in 2008. It was like pretty shortly after a scholar named Seth Schwartz published this book called Imperialism in Jewish Society. And in the 21st century, we see that rabbinic texts are authoritative for the Jewish community and have been for thousands of years. And it's hard for us to imagine they never were. And I think what Seth Schwartz really helped everybody see is that there was no guarantee the rabbis were going to gain authority over the Jewish community. There were many different groups competing for authority in the first century. And then after the destruction of the temple, one of the things he shows is that the Jewish community really almost died out in the second century. It was bad. It was bad. We almost didn't make it. And so the fact that the rabbis gained authority, it was not guaranteed. And he argues that they didn't have much in the beginning, that they're sort of working on gathering it for themselves. And they're using all these rhetorical strategies to try and do that. So it's always interesting to kind of think about these questions. Let Leah ask hers, though. All right, Leah, I've unmuted you. Can you ask your question?
I was fascinated by the little narrative of I think it was today or maybe it was yesterday, of the rabbi who came to a ketubah signing, and very reluctantly he was forced to come, and then he sat there and refused to say anything. And the person who was to sign and determine the ketubah misunderstood that as his disapproval. And so he signed all of his property over and became destitute on account of it. This is another case of stubbornness, refusal to communicate. And it reminds me, I don't know, is there any literature on this? It reminds me of a wonderful midrash about Pinchas and how do you say his name? And Jephthah,
Ifta.
refused to communicate, and for that reason, they were both too proud to. They were trying to pull rank on each other and too proud to go and contact each other. And as a result, Jephthah's daughter did end up having to die. Is there any literature that ties these two things together?
That's a great question. I would guess that at the very least it's someone's doctoral dissertation somewhere. But I don't know offhand.
When in doubt.
Right. I don't know offhand of any books or articles that are particularly focus on this, but there are many stories, biblical and rabbinic, about stubbornness and the consequences of stubbornness. So I would suspect that someone has done some analysis, but I'm sorry, I can't point you to something specific.
Leah, that's so interesting that you frame that story that way. Sarah Ronas wrote that piece for us on that story, and she and I went back and forth much more than we usually do on a piece, because I think that story is really rich and complicated. And I actually read it completely differently from you. I read him not as like stubborn and angry because he was there, but he didn't want to come into the ketubah signing, because if he came with who were the characters? Abba was the guy who was the father of the daughter getting married. And then I can't remember who the rabbis were at the moment, but the father of the son who was coming to the ketubah signing wanted to bring his friend, and his friend didn't want to come because he was afraid it would set up this dynamic that would pressure the father of the daughter, because it would sort of be 2-on-1. And so he was reluctant to come. And he said he was reluctant to come because he didn't want to apply pressure. And then he came anyway, because basically Rav Papa was the father of the son, right?
Yes.
Somebody jump in the chat if I'm wrong. And Rav Papa sort of, who's like a big macher, right? And he's kind of a macher character. He's like, no, come on, I'll go. And so his friend is so nervous about making Abba of Surah, I think that was the father of the daughter, intimidated, that he kept very quiet. And so I didn't see him as like being surly and big in the room, but actually trying to reduce his presence as much as possible. And inadvertently, when he did that, he gave the impression of being surly, and it was this whole ironic cascade of unfortunate events. And then so Abba of Surah, of course, signs away like his entire property to his daughter. And then, this friend is still quiet, and he says, "What do you want from me? I have no money left. What else can I do?" And the friend says, "I was trying to get you to do that." And so then Abu Surah says, "Well, okay, I will retract this ketubah." And then the friend says, "Well, then I'll think badly of you, right? If you sign a contract and take it back." So it's this whole sort of ironic
it's such
cascade.
A sad story. It's such a terribly sad.
It's so sad. It's so sad, and it's so easy to imagine this kind of thing happening, that we so often read things into other people's behavior that's wrong, or we try not to apply social pressure and we're applying it in ways we don't even realize. It's so common. It feels very relevant and current to me, that story. Anyway, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to get us all sidetracked, and it's 10:05. But I thought that's so interesting that you read it so differently from the way I did, which is part of what makes these rabbinic stories great, is sometimes there's a lot to unpack there, and there are different ways to read it. Aaron, why didn't he let him take it back? Because he felt that once you sign a contract, right? We've talked about this a little bit in earlier in this tractate. The rabbis felt that witnessing and signing contracts, those are really serious, and they want them to be taken seriously. And so they actually object strongly to people taking those things back. They don't like when witnesses recant, and they take, in a society that depends on those things, that people need to be able to trust those things. It's bad to sign a ketubah and then say, psych, just kidding. Actually, I'm not going to, once the ink is signed, once the ink is on the page, that's important for the society. So at least that's how I take it, Aaron. So Okay, thank you. Thank you, Leah, for a good question. Thank you, Rabbi Passow, for always a really interesting and thoughtful discussion. And thank you to all of you for being with us as always and thinking these interesting things through with us. And we will see you all in your inbox tomorrow and in this space in another week. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Rachel. Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.